Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Alan Fromhertz, and I am the director of the Middle East Studies Center at Georgia State University. And welcome to our spring keynote lecture, which is co-sponsored by the Middle East and North African Studies Center at the University of Michigan. And we're very grateful to partner with them for this talk. I want to introduce you to Ur Pesce. He is an assistant professor of history at Lehigh University. Born and raised in Turkey, he received his PhD in history from Stanford University in 2016. He previously taught in the history and literature program at Harvard University and in the history department at Bard College. His publications have appeared in Middle Eastern Studies and in IJMIS, or the International Journal of Middle East Studies, as we like to call it, and one upcoming in New Perspectives on Turkey. His book, Island and Empire, How Civil War in Crete Mobilized the Ottoman World, will be published by Stanford University Press in June 2024. And this second book project examines the history of sound and silence in the late Ottoman Empire as well. Okay, everyone, let us welcome Ur and give him a little round of applause.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for this introduction and for inviting me. And thank you, Munazil, as well. And thank you so much, Warsan. You are coordinating all the way from Michigan. And thank you, everyone, for being in this room and for everyone for joining remotely. I will be looking at the people in the room. I will be looking at my screen. So just heads up, if I look a little bit weird, my eyes will be all around. But what a super Tuesday to be here with you talking about my upcoming book. And I would like to begin with a confession. And I hope this confession will also serve as a brief historical context for today's talk. I often judge books by their covers. My book will be out in the world in a couple of months, in June. So I think it will be only fair if I did the same for mine. The photograph you see was taken by Giuseppe Gerola, an Italian historian who traveled throughout Crete around the turn of the 20th century. He was on a mission: document the traces of Venetian art and architecture. The unified Italy showed special interest in this island because of its 4-century-long Venetian past. In the 17th century, the Ottomans seized the island from the Venetians after a siege that lasted almost 25 years. Likely the longest siege in recorded history, but don't quote me on that. Maybe there is a siege that lasted 26 years. This was the last major Ottoman conquest. This historical legacy invested the island with a deep emotional power, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of protesters across the Ottoman Empire. Their protests emerged in response to the declaration of the island's government to unite with Greece in 1908. Among hundreds of protest petitions from across the Ottoman Empire, one from the small town of Keşan described Crete as a precious jewel in the Ottoman crown. This recalls how the island was known in the Venetian imagination, the most beautiful crown to adorn the head of the most serene republic, Serenissima. After this brief context, now let's take a closer look at Gerola's photograph. It pictures two boys leaning against the Venetian wall in Iraklio, the largest city of the island. The wall evidently underwent some changes in the form of removals, fillings, and additions during the following Ottoman centuries. The boys' identities are unknown to us, but certain details in their appearance offer clues. Both are wearing knee-high boots, known as stivania, worn by Cretan males, regardless of religion or regional background. The boy on the right is sporting a red vest. This is a black and white photo, of course, but he's sporting a red vest. While the one on the left is wearing a black scarf. Their headgears suggest different religions, Islam and Greek Orthodox Christianity. Other than this, they have no distinctive physical markers of identity. What this image doesn't reveal are several elements of culture common to these boys. Muslims and Christians of Crete were not sectarian communities, but intimately familiar with one another, sharing a special island identity. Both communities spoke Greek. They often lived in mixed villages, and in mixed urban neighborhoods. They proudly recited the verses of sorrow and love from the 17th century epic poem Eratokritos. They enjoyed eating snails. This culinary detail is worth highlighting if you think about the fact that eating snails was not very common or popular on other Greek islands or on mainland Greece. For the Ottoman Muslims in Anatolia and in the Balkans, it was more than being unpopular. Eating snails was a taboo. Today, even today, there's a famous saying in Turkish, selling snails in a Muslim neighborhood. It is used to suggest culturally offensive situations. The notion of cultural intimacy between Crete's Muslims and Christians constitutes the basis of my examination of the intercommunal violence in Crete in the 1890s as civil war. When this photo was taken in 1901, the population of the city of Iraklio was equally divided between Muslims and Christians. But only 5 years earlier, this wall had witnessed unusual scenes of misery, poverty, hunger, and anger produced by being a refugee. In 1896, there were more than 35,000 Muslim peasants living as refugees in Iraklio. They were dispossessed and displaced from their villages in the interior as a result of the civil war. Let's go back to those days of civil war. Under a scorching sun in August 1896, thousands of displaced Muslim peasants congregated outside the gates of Iraklio. They were assembled around two corpses of their fellow Muslims. The dead bodies had been brought there from a village about 20 miles south. The killings happened while they were trying to collect their belongings from the village now under Christian control. Before the city gates lay two lifeless bodies to be presented to the European diplomats stationed in the city as macabre evidence that death was roaming the land. It was in this heated moment that Hasan Pasha, the Ottoman governor, encountered the refugee villagers. He was face to face with the frustrated people who denounced the authorities and demanded passage through the gates. Hasan Pasha denied them permission to enter and parade their dead bodies through the streets leading to the European consulates. A voice rose from the crowd. If you want to continue subjecting us to the slaughter, look, with accusing fingers pointing to the corpses. The insults from the angry group soon turned physical. Several protesters pulled Hasan Pasha down from his horse and attacked him with sticks. With the help of some bystanders, he managed to run away and took shelter in a shop. When things calmed down a little, through a back street, he walked down to the government konak. In this turmoil, Hasan Pasha lost his fez. Lost too was the command that an Ottoman governor needed most at this time of upheaval in Crete. The episode at the gates of Iraklio in August 1896 paints a picture of how displacement and death catalyzed collective action on an island. This relationship motivates the central question that island and empire explores in a much broader context, from the late 19th century through World War I. How are displacement, death, European intervention, and protest connected in the Ottoman world? The confrontation between the refugee villagers and Hasan Pasha sets the stage for a narrative of displacement and collective action. An episode on an island that soon became a story about an empire. Based on research in local and national archives and in 6 languages, my project contributes to the histories of violence, international intervention, and displacement. First, I examine the strife between Christians and Muslims in the 1890s as a civil war. This distinguishes my work from Greek and Turkish historiographies that have often seen it as a revolution or a revolt. I argue that these terms reproduce state language about violence. They reduce a complex conflict to a nationalistic struggle. Defining civil war as strife between communities that are familiar with one another, communities that share a common culture, I underscore the element of intimacy between the island's Christians and Muslims. In so doing, I call into question sectarian interpretations of conflict that pervade not only historical accounts, but also historiography. I lend an ear to a diverse cast of historical actors who perceive the violence as civil war. In a letter written to Muslim notables, for instance, the Bishop of Retimno Dionysios, underlined the affinity between Christians and Muslims. And I quote, "We both live in the same land. We breathe the same air. We have the same origin, the same customs. We are speaking the same language. We have the same natural vices and virtues." End quote. Around the same time, Meşveret, the leading Young Turk newspaper in exile, published in Paris, expressed dismay at the shedding of blood among the brothers of the country, living together for centuries. Vatan kardeşleri is the phrase that the newspaper used. This was a fratricide. Here I recall the title of a novel by Nikos Kazantzakis, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, who was born in Ottoman Crete. Its title was Fratricides, Adarphophates, in Greek, brother eaters. That is not very different from how the Young Turk publication in Paris, Meşveret, saw the intercommunal violence in Crete. For the Ottoman Empire, Crete was the safety lock of the Mediterranean. This was a pretty common analogy in the imagination of the Ottomans, and not only the Ottomans. For instance, Karabey Karabekov, a Muslim doctor from the Russian Empire, and the future leader of the Union Party in Azerbaijan, wrote in 1910, and I quote, "For Turkey and for all Muslims, Crete is more than just a small island. It is the guardian of our African colonies," end quote. The word he used is mustamlekat. A quick look at the map bears out the geostrategic importance of Crete. As you can see here, it is almost equidistant from three continents, from Asia Minor, from Europe, Greece, and from North Africa, Eastern Libya. What the map doesn't show is that the island is home to Suda Bay, one of the deepest ports in the entire Mediterranean. And Suda Bay is right here near Hania. And today there is a NATO base there, only deep water port in the Mediterranean that is capable of maintaining the largest aircraft carriers, actually. It is this strategic position of Crete that was partly responsible for its joint occupation by 4 European powers in 1897, England, Italy, Russia, and France. This unprecedented act of intervention in the Ottoman Empire truly internationalized a local conflict. After violence, my second contribution relates to displacement caused by international interventions launched in regions with mixed populations. The internal displacement of Crete's Muslims escalated to an exodus from the island after the refugees' demands for repatriation to their villages were ignored by the European occupiers. In 1897, the influential British consul, Alfred Biliotti, in Crete argued, I quote, "The emigration of the country Muslims is the best solution of the Crete problem," end quote. 10 years later, the British Foreign Office suggested that the remaining Muslim minority should be urged to colonize a particular region of the island. During the European military occupation of the island that lasted more than a decade, international policymakers spoke of displacement as though it were the solution rather than the problem. Historians have widely studied the aftermath of World War I as the formative period for the crafting of policies that saw the elimination of ethno-religious diversity as a cure against conflict. I propose an alternative periodization for such internationally sanctioned projects in the name of political stability. I argue that the policies of the occupation powers provide an Ottoman dimension to the contextualization of multiple cases of unmixing of populations, partitions, transfers, and expulsions in the 20th century and beyond. Even recently, a couple of months ago, there was a report about Israeli foreign minister talking about the creation of an artificial island for the Palestinians of Gaza. At its core, my book tells a story of an empire through the prism of an island, but it also intervenes in histories of European colonialism. Go to the next slide. So here, this is a map from the late 1890s when the European states, 4 states that I mentioned, intervened in Crete. They divided the island into 4. This one in the westernmost part of the island is under Italian responsibility. The next one under the Russian responsibility, the one after the British, and the easternmost region of Crete under the French. And here is the Suda Bay, the strategic port. And here is the city of Hania, which at the time was the administrative capital of the island. And this region, the part surrounding Hania, is to be run collectively by the four states. And in the next slides, you see, for instance, the plan of the city of Hania. The city of Hania itself was also split into four: British, Italian sector, French sector, and the Russian sector. And here you have the international sector. We have the flags of the four occupying powers. And in the next slides, you see a scene, a military parade, where you can see different uniforms. This one is the Italian soldiers, but before them, there are the French soldiers, and there were going to be Russian and British soldiers as well, parading through the streets of Hania. And you have a dog for the bombing, the scene. And someone has to write maybe a paper about, dogs in the Ottoman times for the bombing, because there are quite a few photographs. You have dogs in these military parades, or opening of infrastructural works and things like that. In the Q&A, I would be happy to address your questions about civil war or international intervention. But in the remainder of my talk, I will focus on protest, which is the third main contribution of island and empire. The islanders displaced from Crete were resettled in Asia Minor, Syria, and Libya around the turn of the 20th century. I argue that they became the movers of Ottoman mass politics at a time of widening public space after the 1908 revolution. Cretan refugees took the lead in an empire-wide grassroots action. This was composed of public rallies and boycotts of Greece. The popular mobilization in my story is distinguished from earlier examples in protest-rich Ottoman history in three fundamental ways. First, longevity. We have a continuous occurrence of mass rallies between late 1908 and 1911. Second, scope. The protest rallies covered the broad sweep of the Ottoman Empire. And if you go to the next slide, please. Here's a map that I prepared by collecting protest petitions from across the Ottoman Empire in a period of 6 months only. These protests lasted longer than 6 months. They started before January 1910, and they continued through 1911. But in this period of 6 months, you have about 280 locations. You don't see each location on the map. Some of them are very small dots. Basically, these dots, these are the modern borders, obviously, but these dots make out the borders, more or less, of the Ottoman Empire. What you don't see is down in the south, two protest rallies in the Hejaz, in Taif and Medina, and one protest rally here in the west, in Tripoli, Libya. Third difference of this protest movement is its novelty. These political gatherings came in the wake of a three-decade rule of Sultan Abdülhamid II. Under his rule, strict censorship prevented any discussion about Crete in the press. The ban on political assembly prevented the gathering of masses in the streets and squares of the empire. So I'm talking about a novel phenomenon in Ottoman history. But the novelty also relates to the very practice and aesthetics of protest. Flags and banners, speeches and slogans, petitions sent to the government after rallies, and newspaper coverage. All these mark the birth of modern popular protest in the Ottoman Empire. In the next slides, you see a scene of protests from the city of Izmir in Asia Minor. You see only part of the square. This is the main square with the famous clock tower. There are more protesters here to the left of this image. Here you can see, this is black and white, but if you imagine this photo in color, it would be full of red, with the Ottoman flags, with the banners that were mostly in red, and with also the fezzes of the protesters, again, red. Next photograph, another maybe closer photo, again from the same city, Izmir. And you have a group of protesters here, maybe on their way to a protest meeting. And you have a couple of banners here, one banner with the map of Crete. That's about being an island, I think. You can easily put it on the map. The borders are naturally determined. And you have another banner with the Ottoman Turkish inscriptions. It's saying, we would shed our blood, but not let go of Crete. Next slide, please. So here, as I mentioned, there are many petitions stored in the Ottoman archives, sent from protest rallies from across the Ottoman Empire. One petition here, for instance, is from the city of Adana in today's southern Turkey, close to Aleppo. And here you have basically a summary of what the rally was about, what happened in the rally, who spoke about what, how many people showed up, and you have the signatures. And here we have mixed group of people, like leading notables. You have Turkish, Muslim, and also non-Turkish, non-Muslim names. For instance, here you have Dikran, an Armenian Ottoman from Adana. So in the cogent framing of Reşat Kasaba, the Ottoman Empire began and ended with migration. Massive population movements that marked the final decades of the empire mostly occurred in the context of military defeats, from the Russo-Ottoman War in 1877-78 to the Balkan Wars, 1912-1913, and World War I. The coupling of war and displacement largely accounts for the historiographical treatment of refugees as people in need, a mass victimized by catastrophic upheavals. Obviously, it would be unethical to overlook the humanitarian catastrophe caused by these wars. But an emphasis on loss and victimhood obscures examples of refugee activism. Island and Empire features refugees not as the manifestation of imperial collapse, but rather as leading actors in the remaking and reshaping of an empire. Approaching displacement as a condition that generates not only victimhood, but also impetus for collective action, I argue that visible segments of Cretan refugees hailing from underprivileged social classes led empire-wide protests. The displaced life of Cretan refugees away from their islands began in the aftermath of the civil war that uprooted about 70,000 of them. If they escaped a literal death that carried away thousands of their co-islanders during the conflict, their exilic condition actually resembled a sort of death in the sense of being violently severed from all quotidian ties to their homeland. I have in mind such mundane connections as tending to their goats, picking up snails after a rainy day, gathering the harvest of their olive trees, visiting the graves of their ancestors on days of Bayram, religious festivals, removing the wild grass overgrowing there and watering the flowers adorning the graves. As the Palestinian poet Murid Barghouti remarked, displacement is like death. One thinks it happens only to other people. And as the Turkish poet Nazım Hikmet mused, being a refugee is worse than death. These two poets meditated on exile and death because displacement marked their lives. Inspired by them, I see displacement and death as closely intertwined. If dispossession and displacement denote a sort of death for the refugees from Crete, their emergence a decade later as vocal protesters represents an afterlife that restored a sense of agency to them. Given the widespread association of death with an end and with a lack of sound, as suggested by the phrase silent as the grave, it might seem counterintuitive to center death in the examination of something as loud as mass protest. This misleading contradiction disappears if we consider the mobilizing power of death, exemplified by the ubiquity of the rallying cry, Crete or death, in late Ottoman protests. My work is in dialogue with vibrant scholarship that treats death as a generative force that operates in the realm of the living. And I have in mind work by various scholars such as Shana Minkin in the context of Egypt burial practices, Banu Bargı in the context of necropolitics in Turkey, Thomas Lacour, scholar of cultural history of death, and others that I cite in my book. Silent as the grave, and in Turkish we have the expression ölüm sessizliği, silence of death, and in Greek there is a beautiful famous song by the amazing Cretan singer Nikos Xylouris, and it goes something like Kratu tafu siopi. I'm not going to continue the rest, but look it up. It's a very moving song by Xylouris, together with Nikos Kazantzakis, one of the greatest names that came from this special island. And here I'm talking about Crete as a special island, not because I'm, biased, of course. Yeah. In the midst of continual Crete demonstrations throughout the Ottoman Empire, a long article appeared in Speri Saykai Hürriyet, a newspaper published in Istanbul under the direction of Ahmet Javad, who himself hailed from Crete. Titled Cretan Refugees, the article spotlighted their plight in Libya. It concluded by predicting that Crete would remain part of the Ottoman Empire thanks to the effort of, I quote, all Ottomans united together, raising the cry of Crete or death. This was more than mere rhetoric, but rather a reflection of new street politics in the Ottoman Empire. For instance, the protest petition sent from the small town of Seferihisar, not too far from Izmir, mentioned that villagers from nearby joined the townspeople in, I quote, raising the gallant outcry of Crete or death. About 100 miles south, in the small town of Menteşe, the crowds holding Ottoman flags clamored the patriotic slogan, Crete or death. I guess you get the idea. There are hundreds more like this. In the absence of audio recordings of those rallies, I seek the sounds of protesters in seemingly soundproof sources such as petitions and newspapers. In August 1909, the French consul in Salonika reported that every conversation in the city revolved around Crete. He described a rally in Salonika's central square that drew more than 10,000 people. 7 speakers took turns to deliver 10-minute speeches in Turkish, Albanian, Bulgarian, Greek, Judeo-Spanish, Serbian, and Romanian. 10-minute speeches. So this was before academic conferences made it a norm. Sadi Levi's Journal de Salonique covered the rally enthusiastically. According to his front page account, in Salonika, for days on end, 2 words resonated like a refrain, Crete and death. As if to communicate the clamor of the popular chant, the newspaper featured it in large bold fonts in 3 different paragraphs. In the next slide, you will see the front page of Journal de Salonique. Here, I highlighted them. La Crête ou la mort, in 3 places, in bold and in large fonts. In its coverage of mass protests, Ahenk, a Turkish language newspaper from Izmir, observed that every time people heard the word Crete, they uttered, I quote, the patriotic and gallant sound of Crete or death. Ahenk featured this oft-repeated phrase in oversized fonts to render the effect of shouting in the streets onto the paper. Here you can see the next slide. This is the newspaper masthead Ahenk, and here is the part that I mentioned in Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, ya Girit, ya ölüm, Crete or death. Amalfia, a Greek Ottoman daily in Izmir, reported a rally organized by the city's refugee community. The newspaper underlined the placards in the hands of protesters, which read, Crete or blood. Amalfia printed the phrase both in Turkish with Greek letters and in Greek translation. And here is Amalfia introducing itself as the oldest newspaper of the East. And this is the part where ya Girit ya kan. This is in Greek letters, but it's in Turkish, but the rest of the article is in Greek. So this is a variation on the slogan Crete or death. In looking at such sources, I am interested in understanding how mass politics was experienced as a daily process and how a new practice took hold of Ottoman society. During the several years following the 1908 revolution, continuous Crete rallies with their formulaic script introduced people to a new phenomenon. I lent an ear to hints of sound, not only to imagine the experience of taking part in a protest rally, but also to amplify a refugee community whose voices have often remained quiet in historical scholarship. I'm also interested in documenting material impacts of protest rallies and boycotts. In June 1910, for instance, Greek steamers were nowhere to be seen in the port of Salonika. In good old times, every week around 10 of them would visit this prominent port. But now these were extraordinary times. In the empire's leading port city, Izmir, prior to the protest movement, the Greek ships were the most prominent. And here you can see figures from 1908. These are the number of ships, steamers that visit the port of Izmir, with 854 Greek ships from Greece. with 757 Ottoman ships. And in the third place, you have the English ships with 320. So this is a testament to the prominence of Greek businesses in that busy port city of the empire. But their numbers obviously diminished with the boycott in 1910 especially. Writing in June 1910, Austro-Hungarian consul in Izmir observed that the agitation against Greece over the Crete question, orchestrated by the Turkish newspapers, provoked extraordinary excitement among the Muslim population. This was especially the case among the Cretan refugees, who had a population of around 20,000, which is about 10% of the city of Izmir. But there were more in the outlying areas of the city. Similarly, the French consul remarked that, I quote, "The streets have become the property of the Cretans, and the police, afraid to offend the popular feeling, are reluctant to act." Writing in a similarly protest-phobic and Orientalist register, the British consul mentioned that the Cretan population was composed of many undesirable characters. Since the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, they have been a constant source of trouble. They have been the leaders in all strikes connected with shipping, in all acts of violence connected with the Greek boycott. These are the words of the British consul, obviously. For such observers, history began in 1908. There was no acknowledgement at all of what preceded it. They took no stock of the feeling of resentment and anger produced by the civil war in Crete that granted no closure to its displaced survivors. I argue that Cretan refugees animated and mobilized Ottoman society not only through their lively and loud action, but also through their lifeless and silent bodies. In late 1909, 2 postcards were mailed to the Minister of Interior, Talat Bey. So Talat Bey, later Talat Pasha, the Interior Minister. In the back, this part, there was a note wishing him success on the occasion of the Parliament's convocation. Images on the front side of the postcards, however, stood in stark contrast to the festive message of congratulations in the back. We go to the next. Yes. One of them showed a dead man, Hüseyin Subasaki, in baggy trousers worn by Cretan peasants, naked above the waist and with a deep scar in his head. His headband tinged with blood. The French caption noted that he was murdered. Here, assassiné. The Turkish caption that was later penciled in replaced murdered with the word martyred. Here, shahid. This was presented as a hate crime. The other image showed the dead body of Osman Korasaki, taken in the same studio. In this postcard too, murdered, assassiné, was changed to martyred, shahid, in the Turkish translation. 6 months later, the periodical Resimli Kitap featured these 2 images in its June 1910 issue. For Ottoman readers, this was an eerily unusual sight in the pages of a popular magazine. Their publication demonstrates how the targeted audiences of images of death expanded from political figures to a larger public. With the title Cretan Tragedies, the Turkish caption provided graphic details of the death of Hüseyin Subasaki. The opposite page displayed the photograph of Osman Korasaki. The resentful caption read, I quote, "From Crete, a tragic souvenir to the mercy and humanity of the entire civilized world." In such framing, the murder of Muslims of Crete rendered Western ideals of civilization and humanism a travesty in the eyes of many Ottomans. Because remember, Western powers, 4 European powers, were the guarantor states of Crete, so they were seen as being complicit. When these images appeared in print, anti-Greece boycott in Salonika was intensifying. Greek ships were being prevented from loading their third-party cargo, despite the recent decision of the Istanbul Boycott Committee that permitted those vessels to deliver third-party merchandise. Boatmen of Salonika refused to do anything with the Greek steamers, some of which carried Austrian timber and some Russian petroleum. Kerima, the head of boatmen in Salonika, bypassed the resolution of the Istanbul Boycott Committee because of the news that a Muslim man had been murdered in Crete. Obviously, I'm not talking about a displaced person here, but in the dominant narrative surrounding Crete in the Ottoman Empire at this time, the island's Muslims lived precariously, in constant danger of displacement, as befell their more than 70,000 co-islanders a decade earlier. The late Ottoman Empire offers a context to appreciate how the dead Muslim body was politicized. It offers a stage on which death and displacement were cast together and often served as impetus for activism. I started this talk with Gerola's photograph of the majestic wall in Crete in 1901. In closing, I will go back to Iraklio, but only after the passage of 122 years. So I was there last summer trying to look for this wall. It was nowhere to be seen. Can you go to the next? Yeah, so this is where that wall stood, actually, not too far from the port of Iraklio. Here between these two modern apartment, not very nice looking, no offense to people living there. I mean, Turkey and Greece are full of such apartment blocks, unfortunately, the product of 20th century. Between these two, you have parts of the wall, tiny parts of the wall, standing out of sight. The wall's concealment invites a question. What else of the history of our lands remains hidden from our vision? When I regard the massive wall in Gerola's photograph, my mind goes to another wall, intangible. This is the one erected between the common past of the peoples of the Ottoman world. For decades, official histories in the fragmented post-Ottoman Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean have constructed insular narratives. They produced a national subject who has been defined against a historical other. This historical other was sometimes a stranger and sometimes an enemy. Oftentimes, he was both. In the Arab East, for instance, the devastation of World War I caused an erasure that, in the words of historian Selim Tamari, I quote, replaced 4 centuries of relative peace and dynamic activity with 4 miserable years of tyranny, end quote. In Greece, long Ottoman centuries were framed as the dark ages of Turkocratia, or Turkish domination. In Turkey, the multi-ethnic Ottoman past was stripped of its complexities and flattened into an exclusively Turkish and Muslim society and story. One of my central claims is that narrating a history of intercommunal violence through the prism of civil war accentuates cultural intimacy and amplifies examples of shared visions, without, however, telling a sanitized tale of idyllic coexistence. It was not only interstate wars, but also civil wars that generated mass displacement in the Ottoman Empire. Unlike in Greece, Turkish histories have been generally reluctant to recognize the formative role of displacement in the making of modern Turkey. For that reason, refugee voices have often remained muted and muffled. Island and Empire is an attempt to hear beyond the walls. And I hope my talk today has provided you a glimpse. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. So I think, Warsan, are you able to manage the questions from online?
Yes, no questions have come in yet, but there's any questions in the room?
Yes, please send it through the chat, right, Warsan?
Yeah, yes, if you have any questions,
Okay.
please submit it in the Q&A.
Okay. But I will see. Does anybody have a question from the room? Manazil, I see you. Go ahead and speak up if you want to come a little.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Talk about connectedness of displacement and death in your book. Do you tackle any, I know this is specifically in Crete, but do you tackle any displacement, like secondary displacement? So as they're leaving Crete into, I think you said Syria and the Asia Minor, do you tackle any secondary displacement movements in between secondary locations, different countries, and the ways in which it amplifies this Crete or death voice in not only the Ottoman world, but in the Middle Eastern world in this time period?
Did you hear that, Warsan?
Not really. If you can repeat the question, that would be
Okay,
wonderful.
you want to
for the
repeat the
recording.
question? What she was,
So the question is about the relationship between displacement and death, if there are any echoes of that relationship, not only in Ottoman lands, maybe also in post-Ottoman lands. Maybe what I can say about this is that, the displacement of those peasants, and most of them were peasants, started during the Civil War, and it lasted. It was a two-tiered process of displacement. First, they became displaced internally in Crete, and then they are from the countryside, from the mountains, from the hills, from the plains in the interior. So they became refugees in the cities of the island for about at least 1 year. And then their strong demands were to be repatriated into their villages, which were not satisfied, unfortunately, by the European occupiers. And then they were displaced beyond the islands, and they were resettled by the Ottoman state in Libya, in Syria, and in Asia Minor. So in my talk, I drew a relationship between silence and death and displacement, and how it could be as catalyzed for action, popular action, mass action. But what I did not underline, and with your question maybe I can underline, is that for about 10 years, especially in historical records, in archival records, it's very hard to encounter the voices of the Cretan refugees. Because for about 10 years, I need to give you maybe a little bit of context here, because in 1897, there was a war between the Ottoman Empire and Greece, which actually happened over the question of Crete. The Ottoman Empire won, but it was not able to translate that success into diplomatic victory, and it had to pull out of its soldiers, all soldiers from Crete in 1898. So this was, for the Ottoman state, big humiliation. And for this reason, understandably, there was a blackout, press blackout. For 10 years, there was no mention at all of what happened in Crete. Of course, there was also no mention of what happened to those people displaced from Crete. There were only visible evidence in the cities they became refugees in, but they did not become national news, imperial news. They did not find any place in the newspapers. After 1908, with the advent of the Young Turk Revolution in July 1908, we have the reversal of the situation. So in terms of secondary displacement in between, I'm not sure if I have encountered anything specific, but in this period of 10 years, which is like a black hole, because you don't really easily find their voices because of the press blackout and also the archival blackout by the Ottoman state, maybe one way of doing that is through oral history with their descendants. Because in Syria today, still there is a town not too far from Latakia called Hamidia, peopled by refugees from Crete in the late 1890s, and their descendants today are still, some of them are still retaining the cultural traits and the language, Greek language, that their ancestors spoke. Thank you.
so Warsan, I think we might have some from
Yeah,
on.
we have 3 questions actually in the chat right now. The first one is, were there any specific notable leaders who stuck out to you that helped mobilize the protest movements, or was it a collective fondness for Crete?
Oh, this is one of our class students, guys. This is William talking.
Shall I answer?
Yes, please.
Thank you for that question. Again, this is from the period after 1908, when Crete became a flashpoint in the Ottoman Empire. There were actually, and most of them were based in Istanbul. As I mentioned in my talk, most of the Cretan refugees from the less privileged social backgrounds were resettled around Izmir, around Libya, Tripoli, Benghazi, and the Syrian coast. But in Istanbul, you have a very well-connected class of people with Cretan origins who were mostly educated in Mektebi Mülkiye, or military schools, or public civil servant schools in the capital. And they did release newspapers. They formed organizing committees to stage a huge rally in early 1909 in the Sultanahmet Square in Istanbul, which received at least 25,000 people as protesters. So this was a major scene, if you can imagine that, in 1909, at least 25,000. And these are the not official figures. Official figures put it at 100,000, which is probably a little bit exaggerated. But those who were critical of such scenes, such rallies, put the number at 25,000. But this is like a really spectacular number of people to imagine. And in these protests, especially in Istanbul and also in the Istanbul newspapers, there are a couple of people that I can mention by name. One of them is Ahmet Cevat, was from Crete, who left Crete around 1905, 1906. Before Crete, he was an exile in Libya. He was exiled by Abdülhamid for his political opinions. But after 1908, he was based in Istanbul, and he was a very prolific writer. He wrote in the newspapers. He also wrote a bunch of books on politics, history, language. He was a polyglot. There is Mustafa Nuri, again, who hailed from Crete, and he was a high-ranking Ottoman politician. And there were two deputies serving in the Ottoman parliament with Cretan background, one Ahmet Nesimi, the other one Mehmet Ali. So they were also influential in bringing the question of Crete to the attention of the parliamentarians. And there was another person, I should also mention his name, Ahmet Saki, who wrote in a French language newspaper in Istanbul a lot about Crete. And he also had a printing house. And in that printing house, not only books about Crete, but in general, other books also were published.
Great. Sure. From the room. Yes.
Question. So I'm really intrigued by this idea of religious tolerance and the intimacy between Muslim and Greek Orthodox relationships and communities on Crete. I'm curious though, this time period, it definitely coincides with the beginnings of the Armenian genocide and the beginnings of less toleration going out throughout the Ottoman Empire. My question is, would you say that what's the largest component that caused this deterioration in relationships? Would you say that some of it has to do with Turkish nationalism that's occurring at the same time, or would you say it has more to do with the actual Cretan Civil War? I'm just curious because we've got multiple different things that are occurring around the same time period, resulting in sort of this collapse of religious toleration and ethnic toleration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, if you look at the rallies, political rallies.
I'm going to repeat it for the webinar. They might not have heard the question.
Oh, I mean, you were pretty loud, I think so.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You heard that one? Or is that okay? Good. Go ahead.
I mean, if you look at the protest rallies about Crete, it's interesting because on the one hand, I mean, I think the answer is in these protest rallies partly. Because on the one hand, you have this desire to present a common front of the Ottoman nation. Ottoman nation composed of Turks, Arabs, Albanians, Armenians, Greeks, Muslims, Jews, non-Christians. This is the idea to present the Ottoman nation as a unified nation on the one hand. But on the other hand, these rallies are also very nationalistic. Some might call them proto-nationalistic, but I would call them nationalistic rallies with the slogan, Crete or death, our blood. And the blood there did not always refer to potential soldiers' blood who would fight and die to defend the empire, but it might also refer to, and it did in certain cases, to the blood of the enemy. And this enemy, with the change of times and the conditions and circumstances in the Ottoman Empire, this enemy did not always have to be an external enemy. It did not always have to be a Bulgarian or a Greek from Greece. This could be an internal enemy. It became an internal enemy. That's how the Armenian genocide, as you put in your question, unfolded as a process. The Balkan Wars, scholars wrote a lot about the formative influence of the Balkan Wars for the radicalization of the Ottoman states and the turn to quite nationalistic policies. in the empire after 1913. That is important point. But if you are going a little bit earlier, sometimes we are a little bit obsessed with the Balkan Wars. I mean, it's important, but sometimes it reaches like a point of obsession. It kind of like might obscure what preceded before. But if you look at the rallies across the empire, you have similar you have like similar outpouring of quite radical political ideas, quite radical atmosphere, defined by blood, glory, heroism, war, sacrifice, martyrdom. And this is not just something that was propagated by the ruling elite of the state or by the politicians or by the journalists, but by the common people. I mean, that's why I try to emphasize the importance of popular mass protests across the Ottoman Empire, because through these events, it was not only the literate and literary public, but also the general public, the public at large, who had access and exposure to the language of increasing and deepening nationalism and radicalization. But in the book, I mean, right now, maybe I have no time to get into that, but in the book, in the conclusion, I also talk about a very prominent and kind of dramatic figure from Crete named Hüseyin Nesimi. Someone asked earlier about the Cretans getting organized. Are there any prominent names? Hüseyin Nesimi must be added to the list. And Hüseyin Nesimi witnessed the civil war in Crete, scenes of carnage and atrocities. And he wrote 3-volume book about the plight of Cretan Muslims and the massacres against Cretan Muslims during the civil war. That 3-volume work was banned by the Ottoman state, by the regime of Abdülhamid II. So it was not in circulation. But this person, in 1915, he was district administrator of Lice in today's Diyarbakir. He still had quite strong anti-Greek opinions, and I link it to the Civil War experience. But he died very dramatically trying to defy the orders of the governor of Diyarbakir province for the deportation of the Armenians. So he was killed basically while defying the orders coming from higher up, aiming to eliminate the Armenians from the region. So Hüseyin Nesimi is a name that needs to be uttered, mentioned, and also remembered.
Do you want to choose one of these questions, Uar?
Yeah, I can.
Warsan, go ahead.
Do you want to
Yeah,
choose one?
I leave it to you.
So we'll be going through the Q&A and then question in the room, Q&A, question in the room. So the next question is, how has your work been received by contemporary Greek historians? Also, can you draw parallels to the relationship between Greek and Turkish Cypriots?
Cypriots. Yeah. Thank you, Helen, for that question. I hope my work will be received well by Greek historians. I mean, in my experience with Greek historians, definitely it has been received well, and I benefited a lot from my conversations with them, starting from my PhD research time in Crete, meeting local historians and also amateur historians, and really learning a lot from them. And talking about, especially the part where I talk about this conflict that was mostly covered as a revolt or revolution in Greek historiography, talking about that as civil war is something that especially many people from Crete feel sympathetic about. Because the point there is to underline the commonality of these two island communities without getting into the trap of telling a very optimistic and, pinkish or kind of idyllic story of coexistence. And Cyprus question is interesting because, can I look at the question?
Yes.
Oh, I think the question is gone, but I think the question was about Cyprus, if there are any parallels. I don't work on Cyprus, but sometimes when I say I work on Crete, people think that I work on Cyprus because they kind of like equate these two islands in their minds, I believe.
Is very similar.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, but I mean, there are definitely parallels, and there are definitely parallels in terms of how these two islands, both of them in different time periods, became politicized, not only in Turkey, but also in Greece. In the Cyprus case, the politicization happened, of course, in the 20th century, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. And in Turkey, in the 1950s and 60s, there were political rallies, mostly organized with the gentle or not very gentle, push of the official circles, demonstrations in favor of division of Cyprus into two, and also northern part to unite with Turkey. And these demonstrations are very similar in terms of their atmosphere and their slogans to the demonstrations that happened in the 1910s in other parts across the Ottoman Empire about Crete. And maybe the most famous Turkish Cypriot figure, Rauf Denktaş, who was the leader of Turkish Cypriots for decades until his death in early 2000s, he wrote a book, and its Turkish title is Kıbrıs Girit Olmasın. In English, it would be translated as Let Cyprus Not Become Another Crete. So, I mean, its title, I think, is very explanatory in terms of the parallels drawn between these two islands. But their historical presence in the Ottoman Empire over the centuries was quite different. I mean, even though there are similarities like Venetian background and then the Ottoman conquest, but in the case of Crete, I mean, what I try to emphasize is that long-lasting history of siege that made it possible later on in the 1910s, the creation of this narrative about sacrifice, harkening back to the 17th century. And there's obviously very important work done on this by Molly Green and also by Turkish historians Ayşenüket Adiyeke and Nuri Adiyeke. Those interested might check out those books. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Go ahead, Xavier.
And loud,
Thank you
please.
so much for your presentation. It was really lovely. I hope this question makes sense. It's just kind of a making thought. I really love the idea or how you show kind of the agency or action through vocal protest and lifeless bodies. And so I was wondering if you might be interested in doing oral histories in those communities. And so the initial thought is, does or how would it change or affect your methodology or interpretation? Because at first glance, oral history is kind of like the vocality of dead bodies passed through time, because those people that were there or moved are obviously passed away now, but the orality is continued. So I'm just kind of wondering, would it change, or if it would, how it change maybe interpretations or methodologies that you've been currently using?
Yeah. That's a great question. Oral history, I don't know if I will be able to do oral history and kind of use it reliably, but definitely I'm interested. One thing that I can mention, maybe I will not be able to give out the name for privacy reasons right now, because I did not ask that person if I could share his name. So I'm not, but I'm just gonna mention the incident. I mean, someone reached out to me and had read my dissertation. My book is partly based on my dissertation. And in my dissertation, I have a photograph, not the photograph that I showed today, but another photograph of a Muslim man from Crete who was murdered. And that photograph was published in a newspaper front page that came out in Monastir, Macedonia, the newspaper Süngü, in 1911. So I received a note saying that that person that I have the picture of is the great-grandfather of the person who wrote to me. And actually, it gave me shivers, and I wasn't expecting that. And I wasn't looking for the descendants of that unfortunate man from 1911. So I'm hoping to have a deeper conversation with that person who got in touch, and basically how oral history would guide me I have not done oral history in my work so far, but I think I would be really attentive to the fact that what details and what impressions, what family stories are shared with me, and how this story became, for the person who shares it with me, became meaningful, important, moving, mysterious, even hard to grasp, hard to figure out for them. And through their maybe sharing, I would like to embark on a journey of exploration, but this is not something that I can do on my own. So I would need the helping hand of the person who is willing to share the details. And also, maybe my answer is not like very methodologically strong, because this is not something that I have thought very deeply about, oral history. I do respect really people who do oral history. And also I receive a lot of inspiration from ethnographic work, which is mostly based on oral, not histories maybe, but oral accounts. But I have not yet treaded in that territory, but definitely something I think about.
Great.
Thank you.
We have a question from the chat.
Yes.
Thank you for this talk. I'm looking forward to reading your book. Can you speak more about the types of sources you have come across in terms of refugee voices? How have you gone to these perspectives?
Okay. Thank you for this important question. It is, I mean, I talk more at length in the book, but it is obviously very difficult to find very direct voices of the refugees who did not leave written records. So the question of class is important here. And sometimes it obscures access to those voices if there are no written documents. Of course, there are written documents about those refugees who did not leave any recorded accounts, but these voices are indirect voices, so it has to be approached cautiously. That's why I am interested in using the methodology of sensory history whenever I can, to try to hear what these people could have shouted in the protest rallies. Refugee voices, maybe it's hard to come across individual refugee voices from relatively underprivileged class backgrounds, but it is possible to encounter collective refugee voices, people from such underprivileged backgrounds in the context of protests, what kind of speeches they heard, and what kind of slogans they shouted. Class, as I said, is important here. There is a secondary group of refugees. In the historical literature, these people are not always called refugees because they are coming from relatively privileged class backgrounds. But I do regard them as displaced people in my work as well. So these are mostly intellectuals based in Istanbul, journalists. Some of them were also politicians. I regard them as refugees because they also feel the sense of loss. Maybe they have economic and other political privileges at their disposal, but emotionally speaking, they do have the gaping void in their hearts for sure. So it is much easier, obviously, to encounter and to access refugee voices from such class backgrounds because they wrote about this a lot. Hüseyin Nesimi is one person that I mentioned in the Q&A. He wrote a lot, not only during his Cretan chapter in the 1890s when he was based in Crete, but also in 1914 when he was a lower ranking administrator in the Ottoman Empire. Sahip Zuhur is this book that he wrote before he was assassinated, and it's a book that is about 400 pages long. So in it, for instance, you come across very clearly some of the refugee voices. And this person, Hüseyin Nesimi, was was seen by an Ottoman intellectual, Ali Emiri, as a victim of exile. So that is how he was perceived by Ali Emiri, victim of exile. So this is actually a perfect kind of analogy to establish in the case of Hussein Nesimi. Even though he was not a refugee, like many other Cretan refugees, like destitute refugees, even though he was relatively well connected, it did not stop him from being perceived as a victim of exile.
I have a question.
Sure.
How does your work relate to the larger debate over the long divergence theory, Timur Kuran? What I'm asking is, there's this narrative that Timur Kuran, who's a historian of the Ottoman Empire, presented that the policies of the Ottoman Empire, specifically its openness actually to intervention by outside powers, by these diplomatic forces, by the concessions that it gave to Russian, French, British elements within Ottoman society, and the lack of integration of various groups within the Ottoman Empire is the key to understanding why the Ottoman Empire fell apart.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you see evidence either for or against that thesis, this notion that, in fact, it was the tolerance of the Ottoman Empire to some extent that sowed the seeds later on of its dissolution.
I would say, a lot of young Turk figures, like those who were especially associated post-1908 period with the Committee of Union and Progress,
right,
regardless of their ethnic background. I mean, some of them were from Crete, some of them were not. Many of them were not from Crete, but there were also quite a strong group of Cretans in that group. They would agree. I mean, some of them would agree with Timur Kuran thesis because the idea of boycott, economic boycott, for many was that the Muslim elements and Turkish elements, sometimes these were used interchangeably. Sometimes it was only meant to be Turkish. Sometimes it was meant to be larger, like Turkish and other Muslim groups, but interchangeably. But in the case of Cretans writing about the boycott and advocating a strong boycott of Greece, what they usually meant was Turks. So boycott of Greece, but not only Greece, but also Greek Ottomans sometimes, was a means to achieve that fragmentary existence of the Turkish and Muslim element in the Ottoman Empire. Because the idea was that Turks, I mean, this was a little bit of myth. There was some truth to that, but it was, I would say, mostly a myth. So the idea was that Turks never cared about trade, commerce, business. They opted for military. They opted for civil service. That's why they left this profitable fields to others, especially to Christians, and especially, I mean, to a very lesser extent to Jews. Yes. I mean, and funny thing, I mean, not funny or not, I don't know, but in the boycott movement, in the sources, there is a lot of collaboration between the CUP supporters and Jews. For instance, in Greek newspapers writing about the boycott in Greece, in Izmir, because Izmir was a city with a huge Greek presence, and also Cretan Muslim presence, and also Jewish presence. So in the reports of Greek newspapers in Izmir, you would come across a lot of times cases of collaboration between Jews of Izmir and Cretan Turks of Izmir. But anyway, going back to the other question, so the idea of the boycott for many, not everyone had the same position, but for many was that the economic presence and economic prominence of Greeks had to be terminated, and it had to be replaced by the ideally Turkish elements, but maybe for those who are more inclusive, maybe the larger Muslim element. So in their writings, in their political writings, they would identify the ills of the Ottoman state as Muslims and Turks' lack of involvement in commerce and trade. and also the Ottoman states granting of autonomy to provinces, kind of lack of strong centralized state. That was another issue that was identified as the primary ills of the Ottoman state. And the example of Crete is interesting because here we have a province that was autonomous for about 20 years, from 1878 till 1889. And in 1889, that autonomy was cancelled, abrogated by the Ottoman state. But for many writing about Crete, the period of autonomy paved the way for eventual separation of the island from the Ottoman Empire. So we have these two things coming together: lack of involvement in the economy and kind of the granting of autonomous existence to a bunch of provinces.
Interesting. Thank you. I think we have time, Marsan, for maybe one more question.
Or maybe two.
Do you want to do two?
I
It's up to you.
don't mind, you know.
Do you want to choose a couple?
I leave it to Warsan.
Okay, Warsan, you choose.
Yeah, we have until 8:30. I'm not sure.
Oh, 8:30.
8:30. Oh, well.
I think that's the time on the
8:30.
Zoom.
8:30.
But,
Okay.
We can
another
definitely
10
do
10 minutes.
two questions.
Yeah.
A random question from the chat is, how did displacement of ethnic minorities and their attachment to lost homeland relate to the emergence of Turkish nationalism and citizenship in a later context of nation states, especially since ethnicity and religion do not fall neatly into nationalist categories?
That's from Iman, one of my graduate students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big question, and that's a great question. If you think about the displacement of, ethnic minorities, of course, we can talk about so many different groups like Armenians, Greeks as well, not only the Muslim ethnic groups. But if you think about, because I think this question, I guess, is asking about maybe Turkish or Muslim ethnic minorities mostly, and their relationship to the emergent nation states. Again, going back to the question about going back to the Balkan Wars, 1912, and the immense displacement that these wars produced, and the loss of the territories in the Balkans, that became a rallying cry not only for the emergent nation state of Turkey in the 1920s, but even earlier for the Ottoman state during World War I. But what I find really interesting here, we have a country, if you talk about Turkey, we have a country that is, maybe mosaic is not the right word, but for lack of a better word, that is an ethnic and religious and linguistic mosaic if you look at its 20th century history. But in light of that reality, there is very little recognition of the formative role of displacement in the formation of Turkey as a nation state, and also in the creation of official, at least, Turkish identity or Muslim identity. It doesn't always have to be Turkish. Muslim identity that is attached to the identity of the Turkish state. So in a way, the question of displacement and the immense numbers of people who were expelled from their homeland, either through war or through internationally sanctioned agreements like the Lausanne Treaty in 1923, which oversaw the so-called exchange of hundreds of thousands of Turks from Greece and more Greeks from Turkey. So this treaty, for instance, is hailed as one of the founding documents of the Turkish Republic, but the question of displacement that is enshrined in this treaty itself is something that is glossed over. So I think this is the part that I really wanted to emphasize in the context of this question, but there is more to say about this broad question. So if Eman emails me, maybe we can have a larger conversation. But if there's space and time for one more question, I don't want to talk too much. I would be happy to hear.
Which one do you choose, Warsan?
Okay. There's a question by Helen. It's interesting because I visited both sides of Cyprus in 2000 and to 2022, and neither Turkish or Greek Cypriots identify with Turkey or Greece. They maintain a national identity as Cypriots. I haven't visited Crete yet, but would be interested to see if there's a similar sentiment among the locals. Thank you for your answer.
Wonderful question, Helen. There is, I mean, not as strong as there is in Cyprus, I think. When I was doing my PhD research in Crete, it was 2011. So I was there at that time for 6 months. And it was a time when Greece was not doing really well. Economically speaking, it was still struggling with the big economic crisis. And, you know, the IMF and all that neoliberal plight. So I met a lot of people. I mean, this is a little bit anecdotal. This is not like historical research, but I met a lot of people from Crete, living in Crete, and quite informed of what's happening around them in Greece, in the world. And they were pretty vocal about a desire to be left alone, not to be subservient to Athens, you know, to be left alone as islanders, because they also have a historical example to draw on. Because there was a time from 1898 till officially 1913, there was a state in Crete. There was a Cretan state, Kritiki Politia, it was called in Greek. It was under the supervision of the occupying powers of Europe, okay, and it was on paper Ottoman territory, but just on paper. But there was a state called Cretan state. It had a constitution. It had government departments. It had a prince as the supreme ruler, high commissioner. That was the official title. It had a flag. It had a flag of cross and a star, blue and white, red and white. So there is a historical example to harken back for those people today living in Crete who say, we actually need our own state because we are pretty different from the mainland Greeks. And also we don't want to pay taxes. I mean, these are, again, anecdotal. And the example of snails, that snails are huge in Crete, but in many parts of the rest of Greece, not really. I mean, it's not really one of the leading dishes of Greek cuisine, unless you are in Crete. But then, would you call it Greek cuisine? Would you call it Cretan cuisine? That's the question.
It's definitely slow food, though.
I have one more question that's, I think, pretty interesting. How do you see the perspective shift you promote in your book, recognizing the Muslim/Christian relationship, importance of protest, viewing the conflict in more nuanced intersectional terms, relating to later dynamics in the area, or even other situations in other areas of the world? This is by Elias Davis.
Oh, that's a great question. A little bit, yeah, it's a difficult question, actually, and a little bit big, but maybe, I mean, definitely, you know, I try to tell this story not primarily as a, you know, story of Crete or story of the Ottoman Empire. There are parallels. And one thing that comes to my mind is not necessarily what Elias has in mind, maybe, but the formative role of the displaced people in the emergence of nation states later on. And I have the example, for instance, about the Italian decolonization and how the displaced Italians from the former lands of the Italian Empire became formative to the formation of Italy. And I have in mind example of a book by Dominic Ryle about the port city of Fiume, which became a flashpoint between different states, Austria-Hungary, Italy, and the emergent Yugoslavia, and how by looking at one single city, you can actually tap into larger processes of nation making or post-imperial emergence of new nations. So in a way, I see Crete a little bit similar to the example of Fiume after World War I. Again, I mean, there are more things to talk about, maybe related to, interreligious or intercommunal relations or protests that I can talk about later on with Elias, if Elias emails me. Thank you.
Well, I want to say thank you to everyone who's participated, and thank you for all the questions where you have volunteered to allow people to email you
Of course.
if there are some questions that have not been answered.
I mean, I'm sorry, we were not able to, I think, answer all these questions.
There's some excellent interventions here.
And I'm really sorry that I am unable to talk about some of these questions due to time, maybe. But really, I would love to have at least, I mean, maybe virtual or hopefully in person conversation dialogue with these people, some of whom I know, some of whom I don't, at some point.
And I want to thank again, Warsan. You have been so excellent in promoting this and putting this together, and making this a success. So thank you. And also
Thank you so much. It was a great talk.
Thank you, Warsan. Thank you. You've been great from Michigan from the beginning. Thank you so much.
Yes, we appreciate this so much.